Well, thanks for joining us. Hopefully I'll be able to present some models, distribution models that are nice little packages ready to go, and others that I would definitely welcome some feedback on.
Click the presentation. Oh, yeah.
All right, so as most of you have seen already, these are our terrestrial fine filters. Golden eagle, American beaver, trumpeter swan, Dall sheep, caribou, snowshoe hare, and we've swapped out the gray-cheeked thrush for the Swenson's thrush. And a lot of us have had a lot of conversation about this, and it keeps coming back to the Swenson's thrush seems to be a better representative across the CYR study area, and we just have more information about it. So we will proceed from here with the Swenson's thrush. So for the distribution models, and those of you who have sat in on many REAs, this will be old to you. You will have seen Tracy Goddard present this many times. But we developed distribution models in a couple different ways. One is just doing polygon range maps. You'll see this for the caribou as they're really widespread across the state, and those are kind of the maps we have. We also have distribution models that were developed by Tracy Goddard through the AK GAP program. And then in some cases, when the distribution models and the range maps don't work very well, we've used occurrence data to develop new distribution maps specifically for this area. So I'm going to start off with the polygon range map. Many of you have probably seen this. This is what I showed during the methods meeting. And so this is just general from Fish and Game, polygon range maps of caribou herds all across the state. And so when we zoom in on the study area, we have a whole bunch of herds here. And so as I talked with throughout the methods meeting, we've cut that down to 10 herds, 10 herds that are either contained within the study area or have a large portion of their range overlapping with the study area. And so for the basic distribution models, I talked a lot with various ANC members and tech team members about, there's radio tracking data and GPS caller data and a lot of other data out there to start looking at winter habitat, summer habitat, calving grounds, movement corridors, and those will be addressed during the management questions that we have that ask us to delineate these areas. But for the very basic CE distribution, when we're looking at the broad landscape level stuff, I'll just be using these really kind of basic maps. And so this was taken from the North Slope presentation that Tracy gave, just to give you an idea that, for example, for the Western Arctic herd, you can see down in the lower left-hand corner, there are some sort of density or habitat use maps that are available or data that are available. So for when I get into the management question of, where are they concentrated in the winter and where are they calving and those sort of things, I'll get into more detail like this. But that, again, will be covered under the management question point rather than the general distribution models. So caribou are the only ones that kind of fall into the polygon range map. For everything else, we get a little more detailed. And so I'm going to move on to the distribution models that were developed through the GAP program. And so there's 3 species that I'm going to be using the GAP models for, and that's the American beaver, the Swenson's thrush, and the snowshoe hare. And the way, those of you who don't know or haven't seen GAP models before, there's 2 kind of ways that they're done. We either do deductive models, where we talk to a lot of experts and do literature review and come up with close habitat relationships, and then we crosswalk that with land cover that we have on the ground, and we come up with areas that it should be good habitat and where we should see these species distributed. The other way is doing inductive models, and that's where we take point observations, we attribute the points with climate and physical variables, and we come up with distributions that way. And these 2 model types can look sort of different. So these are all for the greater yellow legs of species that we're not looking at, but it gives you a good idea of what the deductive versus inductive models look like. So on the left, we have the deductive, which looks a little more fine-tuned than the inductive model. And in some cases, we combine the 2 models. And the way we choose which model to use or whether we're going to combine them is we do an accuracy assessment, and we look at the accuracy of each model, and which one comes up more accurate tends to be the one we go with. And then we also, Tracy Goddard through this whole program sent them out for expert review to have people look at the different models as well as the final product to say, does this intuitively make sense for what we're seeing in the model versus what biologists are seeing on the ground. Are there any questions about the models before I continue? All right. So first off, we have the American beaver. You can tell from a general range map that NatureServe has that they're pretty much all over the state, and including all of the CYR area. And when we look at the gap model for the CYR study area, it's pretty detailed. You see a lot of riparian areas pulled out there. And so what I did to look at the accuracy of the gap model, because these gap models were developed statewide, so they're done for general, broad, like large-scale areas. And so in order to look at whether they were accurate for the CYR-specific areas, I grabbed occurrence records from a database that we have, as well as from Bison, which is an online source for museum records and other occurrence records. And I looked at how many of these occurrence records fell within the model distribution. And so for American beaver, out of 501 points for the CYR area, there was an accuracy of about 76% of them fell within the model. So it seemed to be a pretty good, the model seemed to fit pretty well for the study area. So moving forward with the gap model. The next one is Swenson's thrush. And so again, you can see that given the general range map, it covers most of the CYR area. And this is just to give you an idea. Let's see if I can move my head. This comes from the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, and so the CYR area is rating here. And you can see that they've got pretty relatively high habitat suitability throughout the CYR. And so when you look at the Swenson's thrush, the green there again is or the range map, and you look at our gap model for the area, you can see that it pulls out good habitat throughout most of the study area. And it does extend beyond what the current range map that NatureServe has shows. And so again, I grabbed occurrence records, and you can see that, yeah, we got occurrence records that are coming out over in this area beyond what the general range maps are showing. And most of them are falling within the gap distribution model. And so the accuracy assessment on this one was 86%, and that's looking at over 1,000 points. So it seems like the gap model is going to be a good one for the Swenson's thrush. And so the snowshoe hare is next. Again, the range distribution is all throughout the CYR study area. There's the range again. And the gap model, however, likes to think that it's only in part of the CYR study area. And when we overlay that with occurrence records, while most of them are falling within where the gap model is predicting them to be, we do have these ones out here. So the accuracy on this one was only 65%, and that was just about 500 points. And I think a lot of that error that's coming is coming along this road here, and then these points out by Kotzebue and the western area. So the next step I want to do with this was looking at a combined model, which was most accurate for the statewide, but I want to pull out the deductive model and inductive model for the CYR area and see if one of those models are better suited to this area specifically. So that's kind of my next step with the snowshoe hare. And so,
am I sitting at your desk?
Is that a
this one
question?
was empty, and I haven't seen anyone here yet. So.
Hey Jim, I think you guys are still on speakerphone there. Thanks. All right, so those are the gap distribution models. So then the last one we have is the occurrence data, and these are those species that polygon range maps are just too broad in general. The distribution models didn't fit quite well for the CYR area. So this is where we get creative and try and come up with a better distribution model based on occurrence data. And so for these, I'm looking at developing new maps for the dull sheep, trumpeter swan, and golden eagle. So this is the general range map for the dull sheep. I'm sure those of you that study or work with dull sheep will look at it and say that doesn't quite look all that right. And when we overlay it with the CYR area And for occurrence record points on there, we can see that, yeah, we've got a lot of areas that aren't even included in those general range maps. So right away, the range maps aren't very good. And so when I underlay it with the gap model actually picks up quite a bit of the occurrence records. It does a pretty good job. But when you look at the actual accuracy, sorry, I don't think I have it on the slide, but it came out as only 23%. And I'm not quite sure where it's not picking up the points in the CYR area, but it seems to not be the best fit.
Is this the deductive model for
this
from GAP, or is this an inductive?
This is a combined model. Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing I could do, again, is to look at the different deductive or inductive to see if there's a better fit. But what I did do was, so when I did the accuracy assessment, I used a bunch of data from National Park Service. Those are all these yellow dots, and so that's what I used to add to look at accuracy. Now, since then, yeah.
Like on some of the points, if you have like multiple points in a very small area, you know, they can kind of skew your accuracy ratings. Do you at all just kind of take only, you know, if a spot occurs on top of itself, only then take it once?
Yeah, and so what I did was anything that was the same essential point, I removed. Another thing, so in a couple of slides I'll show I added more data and from Fish and Wildlife Service, and so we have a bunch of radio tracking data around in this area, and that is points that are reported every 2 hours. And so that's a lot of points, and that's a lot of data in a very concentrated area. And so I didn't include those in the accuracy assessment, but I will be including them when I get into the other models and that sort of thing. So that's a great point.
I mean, just trying to think of scale, I don't know if it would be useful to have like a, you know, a given radius around each point, and if the point falls within that radius, you don't count it again.
Yeah, and so the tricky thing, so I'm going to go to the next slide for a sec to show you. So this is our land cover map. For all of Alaska, we have this, and so every color is a different landscape. So even if you look at these occurrence points, they may look like they're all on top of each other, but they're actually really tiny points that are, you know, in an area like this, it may look like they're all on top of each other, but they're actually falling in different habitat classes. So to merge them together or make these larger conglomerates, if we want to look at what habitat type is underneath it, it may then start picking up stuff that they're not actually using, if that makes sense. So what I wanted to do with the dull sheep was look at this land cover class and lay the points over top. And so I've made them pretty big so you can see them, but they're actually just little pinpoint occurrence points. And you can see here is all the added data from Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I added more points to this, and what I did was then pull out any habitat class that was associated with one of these occurrence points. And when I did this, I actually left the Fish and Wildlife Service points out so that then I could use them later to look at the accuracy. So I used the National Park Service. I'm going to go back. So I used the yellow and the red points to pull out new habitat classes to see if we could come up with a better model.
The GAP model used CYR.
Yeah, it used
Right.
a different land cover class that wasn't as detailed, I think.
They're different
Or
classes.
Different land cover maps in general.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's essentially trying to do a similar thing to what GAP did, but using a different, more current land cover map.
Or maybe, yeah.
Right.
Just the different aggregations of maps.
Yeah.
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 So when we look at habitat associations with those occurrence records, we get anything that's above 1% associated. We get a lot of alpine rocky dry, sparse vegetation, alpine rocky moist. So all of these things intuitively make sense. These are habitat types that we would expect to see dull sheep. And if I compare that to what the GAP model pulled out, we can see that, yeah, these are habitat types that the GAP model pulled out, but GAP model also pulled out quite a few other land cover types that might be dull sheep habitat throughout the state, but maybe we're seeing a difference here in the CYR region, or maybe just the occurrence records we have in the CYR region just tend to be taken in these habitat types, or that they're concentrated there. So I'm open for suggestion on what type of model you want to go with, but thought I'd walk you through 2 different scenarios here. So again, this is the gap model, and and the blue that I just put on top there is if I pull out those top, let me just go back, if I pull out these top habitat classes that are associated with occurrence records, we get this blue model. So even though it's highlighting fewer habitat classes in the gap model, it's actually giving us a broader distribution. So I'm not sure if it's just the difference of the land cover class or why it's doing that, but these are kind of the 2 models side by side.
Well, and especially since it's a combined model for the gap,
Yeah.
that inductive forcing is probably excluding and making that wide distribution across all the land cover types. Because inductive is irrespective of vegetation classes.
Right.
Typically elevation, climate kind of variables. So
Right.
I could see that for sure. It'd be interesting to compare this to the original deductive. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just taking a note. So, as I mentioned, I left the Fish and Wildlife Service occurrence points, the radio take points, out of the model when I pulled these habitat classes, and so now what I'd like to do is use those points to now see the accuracy of the model with these new points, kind of an external comparison. And so I think just from Jamie's comments here, I think the first thing I'll do is look at the deductive model and see how that also compares to these, and then look at the 3 of them and run accuracy assessments on all 3 models again, and we'll pick whichever one seems to fit the best for the CYR. Any questions about that, or comments, or suggestions?
Some of those classes had very few. I guess you chose all of them that had the top.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
wondering if maybe.
So I picked anything. So all the classes in red that are shown are ones that had greater than 1% area associated with occurrence records.
Wondering if there's, did you also look at, I mean, obviously some of these make sense.
Yeah.
Kind of intuitively that those would be there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Done with the dollar sheet. So is that one still a work in progress?
Are those folks that are on the phone, do you have any thoughts about this, how she should approach the model for this species?
Monica, this is Sue. I was just thinking it'd be helpful for Jessica and Miles to talk, probably.
Okay.
Jessica, Miles redid our Bell Sheep range map in the last year, and he's done a lot of work with the biologists at Fish and Game, so there might be some opportunities to get some more of that information integrated into your work here.
Sure, that would be great.
And I know there's a lot of stuff we need to catch up on the caribou too. So
yes.
yeah. And so maybe let's talk offline and set up a meeting and get more connected with this process.
Yep, that would be fantastic. Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is Nancy at SNAP. I was just curious. So obviously, yeah, you've got the various data sources, all of which are somewhat flawed in one way or another, and then you've got the correlation with vegetation. I was wondering if there was any effort to correlate with either DEM, so elevation, or not so much total elevation, but like steepness, like localized change in elevation, or climate. I'm just trying to think of other variables that could be thrown in that might show a good match. And again, I'm not a sheep expert, but I do know that they like steep hill slopes. I don't know if you looked at that at all.
Yeah, so the GAP model, the inductive model, looks at climate and the DEM and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that was included in the inductive model. And there's a management question that gets into forage availability or change in habitat, and for that we will be looking more into the climate and DEM specifically for the CYR region. So that will be addressed, but for the general range distribution models, yeah, I haven't really included it for that. but it is covered in the GAP model.
And I can talk to you later about the GAP model. I'm just curious how the DEM is applied to that, whether it's overall elevation or like some kind of function of steepness.
Yeah, I'll take a look. Tracy was the one who developed them, so I'll look into what her methods were, and yeah, we can touch base on that later.
Yeah, typically, even a deductive model, it's the vegetation plus elevation characteristics, and it's all the elevation derived data. You know, specific elevation values, slope, aspect, topographic convergence, that sort of stuff, typically included. Just depends on how well the distribution points or occurrence points are distributed across it. So my only concern is what Jen was saying, the spatial clustering of your occurrence points. It's obvious that there's an awful lot of spatial bias.
Yeah.
And I think that's just going to be a limit. Sort of the story, typically, you know, with this kind of stuff. And it's too bad the inductive models in general didn't work here in Alaska, because that's the concept is that it gets around that. But yeah, we just kind of work with what we have. But there are some ways, and we can just talk about it later about how to do random sampling from these occurrence points to make sure that we're not over biasing.
Yep, that sounds good.
Are there any interior tree line models?
Al fresco.
Yeah, Nancy will.
Yeah, and we'll be using that in the management question side of things.
Yeah. Some recent research has been looking, at least around here, at the effect of the shift in tree line on, the dome sheet.
And that's on the slate for the management question. Yeah. All right.
And on the tree line issue, it would be good to kind of cross-tab between different veg maps to see if, check how good the agreement is as to tree line, and then, of course, al fresco does, to some degree, model tree line shifts. So if we're talking about modeling into the future, but yeah, at least to start with, figuring out where tree line is, seeing how good the correlation is between different mapping modes.
Yeah.
Good.
And if I go back to this for a sec, the classes that were pulled out from the Vegetation Association map are alpine, rocky, upland. So we are getting a bit of that just on the vegetation classes themselves. A bit into that higher alpine above tree line stuff is just inherent in the vegetation classes.
I'm just pointing out to those who might not know, that the al fresco vegetation classes hopefully would be similar, but they're categorized differently. So if the two ways of classifying the vegetation agree, roughly speaking, about where the tree line is, then that gives better strength to the doll sheet model.
Yeah. All right. Okay, Trumpeter swans. This is the general range map throughout Alaska. And here it is again in green in the CYR area. And this is the gap distribution model. It's pretty sparse. It works really well for trumpeter swans for the YKL area. It seems to be a little sparser for the CYR. And so these are occurrence records that I was able to gather for the area. And you can see, well, they do pretty good in the model. There's areas the model picked up that they're not really in, and there's areas they're in that the model didn't really pick up. And in both cases, they're well outside of what the range has predicted or what the range has delineated. So,
that's kind of, since it might be helpful to look at the subsistence harvest data to see if any of that blank area off to the west there, people reported harvesting trumpeter swans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a really good idea. And you have those data?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'll get with you and we'll add subsistence harvest data to this and see if we can come up with more. Are the subsistence harvest data typically GPS points, or is it like by community?
By community.
Because without knowing where they got them, it's a little tricky to include that in this. I mean, it's fine for looking at range, but not necessarily.
So you could see if there's really that big void over there, and hey, we did get some dichotomy, so maybe there actually is some occurrence in that brownish area. Model predicts the other different.
Yeah. So this was a deductive model, and the accuracy was only 44%, and that was over 1,300 points. Again, we have this issue of a lot of the points are clustered on top of each other, so that's obviously bias or a skewing. And so one thing that Tracy did for the North Slope with raptor concentration areas was she kind of merged, let me see, here we go. She kind of threw a buffer. So around the trumpeter swan here, I put a buffer of 10 kilometers, which is what NatureServe suggests as kind of based on nesting area polygons and their foraging distances and home range sizes. 10 kilometers seems to be a good general estimate on how far they would be moving from those occurrence points. And so what I've done is put a buffer on and merge things together to kind of come up with this more, I guess, a concentration area or general areas that we're seeing the trumpeter swan. And so in red here, our Audubon has identified as important bird areas that trumpeter swans are found in, which kind of overlaps with what we're seeing. But again, any suggestions on what would be useful for people in terms of distribution for trumpeter swan would be welcome. So, I mean, the GAP model, the GAP model pulled out this area as potential habitat for, or potential distribution for trumpeter swan. So even if we're not seeing them there now, that doesn't mean that it's not still good habitat. So if it's more beneficial for managers to know, just where is all the good potential habitat, then it would be worthwhile including that. But we still need to figure out what to do with the occurrence points that weren't picked up by the model again at all. So again, this is deductive model, so I can look at the inductive or combined models and see if one of those fit better. This is where we're at with the trumpeter swan.
This is Tim. I had a question. Was lake density part of the model in there? I'm just thinking yesterday in the aquatic presentation there was, I don't remember the percentages, but a really high percentage of all of the both large lakes and small lakes occurred in these lake districts, and 3 of them pretty well stand out in here. That might be a factor for getting a better handle on is the density of the lakes.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I should also mention, and I meant to mention, I also just got access to a new wetlands map or land cover, wetlands cover layer that we've been working on in-house here, and I will use for the management question that addresses waterfowl, important waterfowl areas. And so through that process of looking at all the different wetland classes and underlaying that with these occurrence points, we may be able to do something similar to what I showed with the Dulce sheet, and looking at which wetland classes and potentially lakeside we find these trumpeter swans in, and be able to come up with a new distribution or a new potential model based on that layer. So that's definitely another way we can go about it as well.
Is that circle by Fairbanks, is that green underneath there?
No.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, the small circles?
It looks like it is hard to see the green.
Like
where that
the
cluster is.
The summer range.
Right, the range.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
So that circle really doesn't even fall in the summer range, the important critical area?
So these range maps were developed by NatureServe, and they could be updated. It could just be a little bit old, and it hasn't been updated in a while. So hence why we're not using range maps for these more details.
I just, if you kind of took that important areas and the green ones and kind of included that little area, there was a heck of a lot of points in that little area, and that might drastically improve your accuracy.
Yeah. Just to clarify, the range maps weren't used in any sort of accuracy. This is just to give you an idea of where the general range is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just the accuracy is based on these gap models and underneath, which the model does pick up that area very well. Yes. So that's trumpeter swan. Any questions or more comments? So moving forward with the trumpeter swan, looking at the 2 alternate gap models, looking at the wetland classes that we can place underneath to try and come up with some sort of habitat associations similar to the Dulce sheet, and trying to find a better distribution model for the trumpeter swan than the current gap model we have.
So this is Nancy again. I was curious, first of all, whether to the west, I mean, there's a lack of occurrence data and the range is considered not to occur toward the western portion. Some of that obviously is up in the Brooks Range, but also might be overlapping with the tundra swan habitat. So there are questions of whether the range is limited by tundra swans or whether the range is limited by availability of appropriate lakes or whether the range is limited by temperature. And when we did our previous modeling with trumpeter swans, we did come up with a complex model looking primarily at ice-free days and linking that back to the literature on nesting and fledging success based on ice-free days. So I wondered, I guess I was, again, curious about what went into the GAP model, whether temperature was considered and whether overlap with the tundra swans was considered.
I think for some...
Temperature is not usually considered in deductive models. Yeah, and there's definitely no accounting for potential competition or any other species.
There is in the sense that if tundra swans and trumpeter swans have, distinct habitats, then often the GAP models were clipped by known ranges. So so there may be habitat out for even further west, but because we know that tundra swan area and trumpeter swans, if there's two species that don't overlap, then those were included. But if there is this kind of gray meshing area, then yeah, that wasn't included. So yeah, Nancy, and we've touched base about this, looking at for modeling for future, looking at length of growing season and what using temperature to say, what's going to be good habitat. That's obviously on the docket, but how that finds into the distribution models, I'm not entirely sure if this is quite the stage for that, or if that's something we'll do down the line for the intersections.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll do it for the intersections. I was just curious at this stage in the process how much of that might or might not have already been included in the range map. But yeah, that sounds great.
Anybody else on the phone has comments about the tundra or the trumpeter swan distribution models?
All right, last one. Golden eagle. This is going to be a fun one. This is the GAP distribution model, and it was a deductive model. Finding occurrence records for golden eagle are fun and challenging. I've talked to a lot of people, and everything seems to fall outside of the CYR study area. There's a lot to the south, and there's some to the east, and some to the north, but finding stuff right in the CYR is a little challenging. So I was able to gather museum records and occurrence data from the Bison online database, as well as we had records in-house that I was able to use. But the accuracy of the GAP distribution model was only 18%. Based on what we had in-house, it was 18%, and that was with 50 points. So when I add the Bison data, we bump up to 185 points, but we drop down to 7%. So, and it could just be because there's so few data. We can see here that there definitely is this arm of golden eagle occurrence points that aren't included in the GAP model, so there are definitely some issues with the model. So how to move forward with the golden eagle? This is the one that I think is the weakest and needs the most help. Again, we can look at doing something like just kind of concentration areas, which will most likely include a lot of riparian corridors, and go into a little more into the literature. And so not just depending on occurrence points, but just looking at basic habitat in general, which the GAP model should have pulled out, but it seems like there's some obvious areas that weren't included that should be in terms of riparian areas. But yeah.
What does the range map look like? Is that there? Do you have that?
The whole thing.
Oh,
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And so there are radio tracking data available, but those are just movement tracks, not necessarily, it seems like nesting data would be the most appropriate, or most helpful. Just there's there aren't all that much data. So if people look at the GAP model, and even though maybe our current points didn't fall within the model all that well, but it's still capturing good habitat, it's just that, you know, search effort hasn't been that great in the area, and people are comfortable moving forward with the GAP model. And again, we can look at the inductive or combined or other models to see if something fits better. Then I'm happy to move that way, because I'm identifying potential habitat and looking how that's going to change is still beneficial, I think, for the REA and for management. It's just a matter of how much faith we can put or confidence we can put in this distribution model.
Well, this is Nancy again, and again, I'm not a golden eagle expert by any means, but Angie and I were just having a side conversation about the challenges, particularly true for this species, but I think true for all species, is that, you know, if a golden eagle ever shows up in Fairbanks once, somebody will spot it, it will be recorded, and then you have presence data. And the same thing is true to some degree for smaller communities, but there's an automatic skew in, you know, a really strong skew in presence-absence data. So in some ways, I would place greater faith in the GAP model than merely in the scattered point occurrences, just because they are going to be where people were. And we all know that, but the struggle with the overlay between, you know, the map that shows golden eagles are everywhere in Alaska, and then the scattered points, and then the GAP model is that, and again, it's true for all these species, is that we very, very rarely have any data on density as opposed to occurrence. And in my mind, for management, you know, for management decisions, density is often a lot more important than occurrence if you're talking about, you know, making sure that the species has the viable range and is in, you know, a healthy population dynamics and all that. So I don't know if anyone has ideas about how to get at that density question for any of these species, but it's at the forefront of my mind.
I'm curious, what sort of attributes are included with the bison data and the GAP occurrence points? Because it seems like you don't really want to exclude like casual observations, just because eagles are broad-ranging creatures, right? I mean, just because they happen to be flying over a habitat doesn't mean that's their habitat that they're purposely being in. Right. Which I know could be the case with some of those bison records, like they're just casual observations, right? So if you can just pull out the nesting ones, or, you know, something that would presume that they're actually fixed on a habitat type, then you could use that for the deductive, you know, accuracy. But yeah, just like what Nancy was saying, I mean, anybody that happens to see one and, you know, is aware might take a GPS point, but it could be en route to somewhere, or it could be right. Not necessarily associated with where you're actually seeing it.
Also, the expert review, maybe you can circulate, you know, these maps within particular individuals.
Well, and two, I mean, I think the reason why the deductive is not capturing, because I'm certain they're more widespread than what the GAP model is showing, is the limitations of the land fire data set. You know, they didn't have riparian areas mapped out well at all. And so using our newer wetland riparian kind of data sets that we're developing for the REA will probably substantially help.
I don't know what the golden eagle eats, but you could kind of look at the prey, you know, what it's eating, and kind of look at the distribution of that layer and see how well that overlays with the habitat and the presence data.
So this is David. In other REAs, you know, the last couple of conversations is where we've had to go on golden eagles. Since they are a species that ranges from Mexico to Alaska, it's kind of a tough question. And so, that question between they're everywhere versus can we get at something specific that actually helps with management. If you can pull it out, we have done MaxEnt models to hone in a little bit better on nesting sites. if that's part of the distribution records up there, and then used foraging habitat around nesting sites to rate quality of those areas. And so certainly, yeah, the discussion is in line with where we've gone with other REAs to try to refine the questions down to something that's just not, you know, the entire ecoregion.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. Yeah, so maybe I can work with you, Jamie, on kind of figuring out a new model of using new base layers anyway to come up with a new model for nesting sites, and then, yeah, looking at prey availability in surrounding areas and looking at foraging habitat that way. That's a great suggestion, David. Thank you. All right. Well, that's it from me for terrestrial models. As you can see, some of them are nice, happy little packages. Others still need, you know, we're still running down different paths, trying to figure out the best way, what's going to be most useful for managers. But we're getting there. We're slowly moving along.
For those that have been more quiet on the phone, are there any other approaches or data sets? Probably we don't want any more data sets. I guess we do.
No, I wasn't going to suggest any more data sets, which we don't have anyhow. But I think there might be some good discussions as to approaches. I wish there were more data sets on density. We do have the data, not so much the data sets, but the methods we discovered previously for the beavers and the swans, where at least the literature has some information on density and breeding success linked to temperature. So hopefully we, meaning SNAP, can offer some assistance with that. We'd love to jump in with it as soon as we can get that discussion rolling. Other species we might not be so useful, although I'd love to maybe discuss some of these a bit more in a separate conversation.
This is Tim. Would you mind going almost back to the beginning, the slide where you showed the caribou ranges that you had kept and dropped?
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, I think my screen's still catching up here.
Oh.
Okay. Okay, it answered my question. That went by faster than I could read the names on there, and I just wanted to see which ones were listed. But so thank you.
Yep, no worries. All right. Well, if anyone has any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm always happy to have open discussions about what we're trying to do over here. And thank you for your time. I appreciate the feedback.